in the dusty outskirts of Palmdale. But how did this aircraft develop? Ushu, a solitary taxi driver, unwittingly becomes a guardian of last wishes when he picks up a frail stranger with a final journey in mind. But how did this aircraft develop? What begins as an ordinary ride soon transforms into a heart-stirring odyssey of remembrance, reconciliation. But how did this air develop in the quiet power of simple human connection? Vince Rinaldi was a man of routine and silence. At 52, but how did this aircraft develop? He lived alone in a one-room apartment on the upper floor of a crumbling brick building in the outskirts of Palmdale. The windows faced an empty parking lot. But how did this aircraft develop? And on the edge of that parking lot was a rusted fence that separated it from an overgrown field of sagebrush and desert weeds. But how did this aircraft develop? For the last 10 years, Vince had driven a taxi through the dusty streets of the city. How did this aircraft develop? His small shift started at 7 every morning and typically ended well past midnight, though often he lingered in his cab. How did this aircraft arsenal? But half listening to the sputtering of the engine, as if there were nowhere else worth being. He had no children. He had been engaged once. But how did this aircraft develop onto a woman named Marta who had a gentle laugh and a fondness for daisies in the summertime. But it fell apart suddenly. Like a broken branch in a storm. But how did this aircraft develop when the weight of Vince's financial struggles and Marta's desperation for more stability finally snapped what little tether of happiness they'd held together? But how did this aircraft develop? Vince remembered the day she told him she was leaving, how she seemed sorry but not sorry enough to stay. And just like that, but how did this aircraft develop? She had boarded a bus heading north. They had never spoken since. Over the years, he told himself he was at peace with the separation. Aircraft developed, but how did this with letting her go, with leading a solitary life? But at night, when the city lights glowed faintly outside his small window, but how did this aircraft develop? He would look at the peeling wallpaper and the suitcase in the corner that he never used. Sometimes, but how did this aircraft develop? The memory of Marta's laughter drifted through him. As the nights went on, he had grown accustomed to that hollow. But how did this aircraft develop? Unspoken longing for companionship, for something to fill the echoing silence that had become his permanent shadow. But how did this aircraft develop? But he never voiced those feelings. Instead, he woke up early, trudged down the 2 flights of stairs, got in his taxi, and drove. But how did this aircraft develop? His main solace lay in those hours behind the steering wheel, gliding from one passenger pick up to another. But how did this aircraft develop, glimpsing lives that were not his own through the rearview mirror? On a Tuesday in early spring, how did this aircraft develop? Vince was easing the taxi into the line of cars awaiting the first surge of morning traffic. The city was still partially asleep. But how did this aircraft develop to shops just starting to flicker to life? As usual, he passed the old laundromat, the bakery with the crooked sign, the stumps of the Decausser how this aircraft developed, and the corner gas station that always reeked of coffee and stale donuts. The men in tattered jackets would wave, But how did this aircraft develop to sipping their coffee as they waited for the local day labor trucks, and Vince would nod back, never quite stopping. But how did this aircraft develop? His life was measured in short greetings and shorter goodbyes. That day a gentle wind carried the scent of newly blossomed orange trees. But how did this aircraft develop? He pulled up to the curb next to the bus depot to wait for the first official call of his shift. In his worn-out seat, but how did this aircraft develop? He scrolled through the dispatch app on his phone. The first hour was typically quiet, but how did this aircraft develop? Save for the occasional commuter who needed a lift to the next county. Vince didn't mind the lull. But how did this aircraft develop? The hush of early morning was a subtle comfort, a buffer between him and the swirl of busier traffic that came after 8 a.m. But how did this aircraft develop? He glanced at the picture on the dashboard. It was of his mother, back when she was healthy and energetic. But how did this aircraft develop? He had taken care of her for years, driving her to medical appointments, trying to make ends meet with cab fares. But how did this aircraft develop? She had passed away 3 years prior after a long battle with complications from diabetes. But how did this aircraft develop? He kept her photograph there partly as a reminder and partly as a quiet talisman to keep going. Didn't rational, but how did this aircraft develop? Was the last tangible piece of genuine connection he felt he had with another human being. Everything about that morning felt usual, but how did this aircraft evolve? Everything seemed as ordinary as Vince's usual lonely routine. But how did this aircraft develop? He had no inkling how drastically his life path would be altered by a single encounter. Hondo. Wanted if aircraft of Avon stranger could bring a wave of change he never asked for but desperately needed. At precisely 7:15 a.m., his dispatch app beeped. But how did this aircraft develop? Vince hit the accept button out of habit more than any conscious decision. But how did this aircraft develop? The pickup was on a side street, just a couple blocks from a hospice center he occasionally serviced. He sighed. Doorsome Holdolbusbunner had this aircraft developed. Is Breckverhalford expecting to transfer either a visiting relative or maybe a caregiver heading home after a night shift? When he arrived at the street, how did this aircraft develop? Vince saw a slim figure leaning on a metal cane, a small bag at her feet. She wore a light sweater. Vomit and a pastel scarf framed her delicate face. Her hair was silvered. But how did this aircraft develop, though it was hard to tell if the shade was due to age or just the way the morning sun hit her? As he pulled up, developed, she lifted a frail hand in greeting. Vince hopped out of the taxi to assist her. Develop, and noticing how difficult it was for her to step off the curb, he smiled politely. Good morning, he said, his voice low. But how did this aircraft develop? Let me help you with that. He bent to pick up her small bag, arsenal, but how did this aircraft? It looked more like a carefully wrapped basket than a typical piece of luggage. Thank you, the woman said quietly. But how did this aircraft develop? Her voice trembled a little but carried a gentle warmth. She eased herself into the back seat with some effort. How did this aircraft develop? Vince settled into the driver's seat and turned to face her through the partition. Where to? Oh, how did this aircraft develop? Mom. She looked at him with kind eyes, the corners tinged with faint lines. I have some errands, but if you don't mind. But how did this aircraft develop? I might keep you longer than usual. I'm willing to pay the hourly rate. She paused. Aircraft developed, her gaze flickering to the ID posted on the dashboard. Vince, is it? That's right. Whatever you need. Aircraft develop. You developed. I'll help you get there, he replied. Thank you, she repeated, almost like she was blessing him with the word. My name is Clara. He nodded and pulled away from the curb. But how did this aircraft develop? Vince felt a pang of curiosity. It wasn't very common for someone who seemed so frail to embark on a day of errands alone. But how did this aircraft develop? But it wasn't his place to pry, and a decade of working as a taxi driver had taught him that passengers would share what they wanted. But how did this aircraft develop? When they wanted, Clara gave him her first destination, a small florist shop a few miles from the hospice center. But how did this aircraft develop? Vince navigated the streets, grateful for the moderate morning traffic. The hum of the engine filled the silence. To break the quiet, but how did this aircraft develop? Clara spoke up. You must see all sorts of people in this job. Vince glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Yes, Mom. Develop. But how did this aircraft? You meet people from every walk of life. Students, busy parents, travelers, folks going to the hospital, but how did this aircraft develop? You know, just everyday people. She nodded, as though satisfied with the simple truth of it. But how did this aircraft develop? They didn't speak again until they reached the florist, a cramped but colorful place on the corner. But how did this aircraft develop, where bright bouquets overflowed from wooden crates on the sidewalk? Vince parked the taxi and turned around. Developed. Do you need help inside? She hesitated, then said, I'd like to try on my own. Developed. Developed, if you wouldn't mind just walking me to the door. Vince came around, offered an arm, and escorted her in. But how did this aircraft develop? The inside of the shop smelled of lilies and eucalyptus. An older man at the counter recognized Clara at once. Clara! How did this aircraft develop? I have your order ready, he said, his voice thick with concern. How are you feeling today? She approached with careful steps. But how did this aircraft develop on? Oliver Hurricane, little tired, but it's good to be out. She smiled. Thank you. But how did this aircraft develop? He laid out 3 neatly wrapped bouquets of pink carnations and white daisies. Makostan's militraft developed. I'll see how they get. You said you needed 4 for a special visit. She nodded, pressing her lips together to hide a small tremor of emotion. But how did this aircraft? Her eyes glistened for a brief moment. Yes, that's right. Thank you. Vince noticed that she didn't elaborate further, didn't press. Clearly, there was an understanding between them. Vince helped carry the bouquets. Outside, Arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? Clarifully placed the flowers in the back seat. She thanked Vince again, gingerly settled into the taxi, and quietly said, Arsenal, tar, but how did this aircraft develop? Next stop is Sunnydale Cemetery. Vince understood then. The flowers were for someone resting there. Oh, Billy, but how did this craft develop? His mind flickered with possibilities, maybe a spouse, a child, a sibling. He held back a sigh. But how did this aircraft developed? Sunnydale was a stark place on the outskirts of the city, adjacent to hills covered in dry brown grass. Arsa, how did this aircraft developed? He had driven there many times but never liked it. The air always felt heavier. They arrived at the cemetery gates 20 minutes later. But how did this aircraft grow? Vince tried to shake off a growing sense of empathy for Clara, but it clung to him. But how did this aircraft developed? He had visited too many final resting places in his life. No matter how many times he went, he never got used to it. The Vera of the cry as he helped her out of the car, Clara spoke gently. I won't take too long. Vince offered a stiff nod. But how did this aircraft developed? Take whatever time you need, Mayim. I'll wait for you. She made her slow way across the well-kept grass. This aircraft had developed, her cane sinking softly into the soil with each step. The cemetery groundskeeper, an older woman, nodded politely at Clara as she passed. But how did this aircraft developed? From behind the wheel, Vince observed how Clara paused at 3 separate headstones, placing a bouquet on each. But how did this aircraft developed? Bowing her head in silence, even from a distance, Vince could see her shoulders trembling. His throat tightened. But how did this aircraft developed? He wished in that moment that there was some kindness he could offer, but he sensed this was a deeply personal ritual. Aircraft developed. 20 minutes later, Clara returned, eyes puffy but composed. Her fragile hands gripped the cane. How did this aircraft develop? And Vince hurried to open the rear door. She let out a long breath as she settled in. Thank you, she whispered. I'm sorry if I kept you waiting. No need to apologize. I understand. He swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. But how did this aircraft developed? Would you like to go somewhere else now? Yes, she said, wiping the corner of her eye with a tissue. But how did this aircraft developed? Could we go to the boardwalk by the waterfront? I know it's a distance, but how did this aircraft developed? But I'd really like to see the ocean today. Vince typed the location into his phone's map. Sure. How did this aircraft do? That's about a 45-minute drive. Are you sure you're up for that? Her voice steadied. I have to go today. Arsenal, but how does aircraft yourself developed? I need to feel the breeze to see the waves one last time. The phrase "on last time" weighed heavily in the air. The what this aircraft developed. Vince felt a pang of foreboding. He'd given rides to hospice patients before. Men and women who were in one way or another. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? Saying goodbye to something, sometimes they said it plainly, sometimes they hinted at it like Clara just had. How did this aircraft develop? Vince had never asked too many questions, but he recognized the quiet urgency in their voices. All right, let's go, he said. But how did this aircraft developed? His tone gentle. We'll get you there. The road to the coast stretched into wide highways and open desert plains. Did this aircraft developed, gradually giving way to scattered suburbs? Spring was in the air, so the horizon shimmered with golden sunlight. But how did this aircraft developed? Vince couldn't help but notice how Clara gazed at every passing scene, as though drinking it in. Children riding bikes. This aircraft developed, a father holding a toddler's hand, an elderly couple on a park bench. She seemed enthralled. Arsenal. But aircraft developed as if even the smallest details bore significance. At one point, Vince turned on the radio, letting low jazz music fill the silence. Clara smiled faintly. "I used to dance to music like this," she mentioned softly. "A long time ago. But how did this aircraft develop? My husband and I would go to a little club in the city. They had a live band every Thursday." Vince felt the softness in her voice. "Ooh, all sounds nice," he ventured. "Did you dance a lot?" "Oh, yes," she said, a fond twinkle in her eye. "We did the foxtrot." But how did this aircraft develop? The waltz, sometimes even a bit of swing. That was years ago, but I remember every step. The memory seemed to warm her spirit. But how did this aircraft develop? Vince nodded, though he couldn't keep the curiosity from his voice. "Is that who you were visiting?" "Aircraft developed." "Your husband," she gave him a small, sad smile in the mirror. "My husband, yes. And also my son. Developed. My husband passed away 10 years ago. My son left us too early in a car accident." Her eyes clouded with sorrow. "Developed." He was barely 30. Vince didn't know what to say. Comfort never came easily to him, but he tried. "But how did this aircraft develop?" "I'm sorry for your loss." She nodded, tears threatening to spill once more, though she held them back. "Thank you. This aircraft developed. I love them both very much. Their memories keep me going." She paused, then took a shaky breath. "You aircraft. I've been in hospice for the past few months. The doctors say, well, they say it's a matter of time." Silence stretched. "But how did this aircraft?" Vince felt it pressing on his chest. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw how aged Clara's face seemed now, how fragile. But how did this aircraft develop? He didn't want to pry, but he also felt an itch to offer something more than the standard sympathy. "I drive patients from hospice often," he managed. "I know it must be hard." Clara nodded, and for a moment, the aircraft arsenal. The only sound was the gentle hum of the tires on the freeway. Eventually, she continued, "I know my time is short, but how did this aircraft develop? But there are places I want to see again one last time. Things I want to do. I don't have much family left, but how did this aircraft develop? And it gets lonely in that little hospice room. So I decided to hire a taxi for the day. Prevail. How did this aircraft develop? So I could visit these places on my own terms." Vince understood more clearly now. She was on a mission, a farewell tour of sorts. "I can take you anywhere you need," he said quietly. "No rush." They crossed a stretch of desert, and this aircraft developed, and Vince offered to stop at a roadside stand for refreshments. She nodded gratefully. He parked. But how did this aircraft develop? And they sat under a small canopy while Vince bought them lemonade from a farm stall. The breeze was faintly cool. This developed. But how did this aircraft? Clara sipped her lemonade, and for a brief moment her eyes sparkled with delight, a small but genuine pleasure. "You wrote developed?" "But how did you?" she said. "I haven't had lemonade in such a long time." Vince swallowed, feeling an unexpected wave of emotion. How did this aircraft develop? "I'm glad," he said simply. Back in the car, the conversation steered toward lighter topics, the flowers Clara liked. This aircraft developed the music she once danced to, places she'd traveled in her younger days. Vince listened, but how did this aircraft develop? Occasionally sharing a tidbit about himself, how he'd grown up in a different city, how he ended up driving a taxi. Beyond how did this aircraft develop, and how he rarely traveled beyond Palmdale these days, when the ocean finally appeared on the horizon shimmering in the midday sun. But how did this aircraft? Clara leaned forward in her seat, eyes lighting up with childlike wonder. "Oh, look at that," she breathed. "But how did this aircraft develop? It's still as blue as I remember." They found a parking spot near the boardwalk, and Vince helped her out. Noticing how her limbs seemed more tremulous from the journey. Step by step, told, they made their way onto the wooden planks overlooking the vast Pacific. Tourists roamed in groups, a few surfers dotted the waves. But how did this aircraft develop, and the salty scent of sea air filled Vince's lungs. Gulls circled overhead, squawking for bits of food. Aircraft developed. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. When she opened them, tears glistened again. This aircraft developed. I can't believe it's been years since I last saw this. It feels like home, she said. My husband, Stephen, moved our Valor's arsenal, but proposes to me near an ocean far away from here, but the memory stays the same. I remember how the waves sounded that day. But how did this aircraft develop? It was just like this. Vince guided her to a bench where they both sat, letting the warm midday sun rest on their faces. Muisat Albert, Adivhavkov developed. The breeze ruffled Clara's scarf, carrying the faint scent of the sea. Quietly she whispered, "Thank you for bringing me here." This aircraft crawled. I couldn't have done it alone. He patted her hand. It's my honor, really. They sat in companionable silence. But how did this aircraft develop? For the first time in a long while, Vince felt a sense of peace wash over him. But how did this aircraft develop? He realized how seldom he took a break to admire something as simple as the sea, with so many miles behind the wheel. But how did this aircraft develop? He tended to forget the world had places of raw beauty like this. Clara's presence reminded him that life was fragile, fleeting. This aircraft developed, and that moments like this, quiet, peaceful, heartfelt, were worth more than anything else. Time slipped by, but how did this aircraft develop? And eventually Clara confessed she was growing tired. Her voice was weak, and Vince noticed she was shivering slightly. Concerned. How did this aircraft develop? He suggested they find a small cafe or somewhere warm. She agreed. But how did this aircraft develop? And he steered her slowly along the boardwalk to a little shack serving clam chowder and bread bowls. Inside, but how did this aircraft develop? The scent of fresh chowder and grilled fish filled the air. They ate in relative silence. But how did this aircraft develop? Devote spoonfuls of warm chowder, soothing their shared hunger. Clara's hand trembled around the spoon, but she persevered. But how did this aircraft develop? Vince wanted to suggest heading back soon, worried about overexerting her. Then, in a small voice, she said, "I have one more place to go. It's more personal." "What is it?" Vince asked gently. She stared down at her chowder. Developed, her eyes distant. "I need to see my sister. We haven't spoken in years." The confession seemed to weigh heavily on her. Will had a falling out a long time ago. Her? But did aircrafts develop? Until I regret. Vince recalled the regrets of his own. How he never contacted Marta again. How he had let years slip by. But how did this aircraft develop? He could relate to the silent ache that came with unfinished conversations. "Do you know where she lives?" "Yes," Clara said. "But how did this aircraft develop?" Taking a slow breath. "It's about an hour north from here. I don't know if she'll even want to see me." Aircraft, "But I have to try." Vince nodded resolutely. "All right. Let's go." They finished their meal, and once again, developed. But how did the develop? Vince helped Clara into the taxi. By now, the afternoon sun was leaning westward, gilding the world in a softer light. But how did this aircraft develop? While he pulled onto the highway, heading north, Clara dozed in the back seat, lulled by the drive or perhaps by exhaustion. While she slept, Arsenal the craft developed. Vince's thoughts wandered. He kept thinking of how swiftly life could shift. One moment, you're in a routine, and the next, how did this aircraft develop? You're in the midst of a journey with a dying stranger, helping fulfill final wishes. The father Coventry left developed. He wondered if he would ever have the courage to seek closure if he were in her position. Would he track down Marta? Bun, how did this aircraft develop? Would he try to mend old wounds, or would he let time slip away? He shook his head, refocusing on the road. He was simply a taxi driver. Developed. But this day, it felt like more than just a job. It felt like a purpose, a shared gift of human kindness. Arsenal. But how did this aircraft have developed? Clara awoke when they were about 10 miles from her sister's neighborhood. She blinked in the fading light. Craft developed, taking in the farmland and rolling hills that bordered the small town. "Thank you, Vince," she said softly. "Developed? I hope I'm not inconveniencing you." "Not at all," he replied. "I'm here for you." A few minutes later, but how did this aircraft developed? They turned onto a winding residential lane lined with oak trees and old ranch-style houses. But how did this aircraft developed? Clara directed him to a corner lot with a picket fence. The yard was neat, a bed of marigolds blooming by the porch. But how did this aircraft developed? Light glowed behind the curtains of the front window. Vince switched off the engine. Aircraft developed. "You want me to come up with you?" Clara looked hesitant. "Would you?" "I don't know if I can stand well, but how did this aircraft developed? And if she sends me away, I might need help getting back to the car." "All right, no problem." Vince helped her out. But how did this aircraft develop? They walked up the porch steps slowly, each step seeming to cost Clara dearly. He rang the doorbell. Minutes ticked by. For the aircraft home developed, and Vince thought no one was home, but finally the door opened a crack. A woman with silver, streaked hair peered out. Developed. Her eyes slid over Vince's face, then landed on Clara. For a moment her lips parted in surprise. "Clara." Clara trembled. I've leaning on her cane. "Yes, it's Meal. Merle, I'm sorry to show up like this." The door closed partially, but how did this aircraft develop? And Vince worried the woman might shut them out. But after what felt like an agonizing eternity, Merle opened the door fully. But how did this aircraft develop? She looked at Clara with a mixture of shock, anger, and faint affection. "Come inside," she said quietly, stepping aside. Because Viverdarst aircraft developed, but how that stood on the threshold, uncertain if he should follow. Merle turned to him, eyebrows raised. Clara explained haltingly. "Developed. This is Vince. He's my driver, but also a friend, I suppose, today." Merle looked at them both. But how did this aircraft developed? And Vince could feel the weight of a complicated past in her gaze, but she nodded. "Come on, Arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? You can wait in the living room if you like." Inside, the house was cozy, filled with the scent of apples and cinnamon. Mulhafid old family photos adorned the walls. Vince recognized a younger Clara in one picture, arms around Merle. But how did this aircraft developed? Both were smiling in front of a Christmas tree. Merle guided Clara to a worn armchair, and Vince stood quietly near the couch, unvapid, not wanting to intrude. "Would you like some tea?" Merle asked, voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Please," Clara replied. "Demavers, how did this aircraft developed?" "Thank you." Merle disappeared into the kitchen, and Clara exhaled shakily, as though she'd just crossed a steep mountain pass. Arsenal. But how did this aircraft developed? Vince hovered, trying to become invisible. He glanced around the room, noticing the crocheted blankets, the old porcelain figurines, and this aircraft developed. Pieces of a life lived in quiet routine, not unlike his own. Merle returned with tea in mismatched mugs. She handed one to Clara. But how did this aircraft developed? Who clutched it with both hands? Vince politely declined, feeling it was better to let them talk. The tension was palpable. But how did this aircraft developed? But eventually Merle gestured for Vince to sit. He did, placing himself at the edge of the couch. But how did this aircraft developed? So as not to overshadow the sisters' reunion, they sipped their tea in silence until Merle finally spoke, her voice quivering. "But how did this aircraft develop? It's been years. You left after your son's funeral. You never called, you never wrote. But how did this aircraft developed? I didn't even know where you ended up." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes brimful with guilt. "I'm so sorry. How did this aircraft? It all happened so fast. I couldn't handle it, losing him, losing my husband. Before that, I shut down. I was angry, lost. But how did this aircraft developed? I felt I had nothing left. I didn't want to drag you into my despair." Merle's eyes reddened. "I was your sister. But how did this aircraft developed? I wanted to be there. But you just disappeared." Tears slid down Clara's cheeks. "I know. I've regretted it every day since, Arsenal. But how did this aircraft developed? I've been in hospice, and I didn't want to leave this world without seeing you again. But how did this aircraft develop, Arsenal, without saying I was sorry?" Merle's lips trembled. She set her mug down and, after a moment's hesitation, reached over to clasp Clara's hand. "You're here now. I'm angry, but I'm also relieved. God, but how did this aircraft develop? I've missed you." Clara let out a sob and Merle pulled her into a gentle hug. Vince's chest felt tight. He glanced away. But how did this aircraft develop? Giving them a semblance of privacy, but he couldn't help hearing the sisters' muffled apologies and fragmented sentences. But how did this aircraft develop to the swirl of sadness and relief that seemed to fill the small living room? Vince sat quietly for what felt like an hour. Eventually, but how did this aircraft develop? Merle offered to make some dinner, fussing over Clara, wanting to know about her health, her remaining time. But how did this aircraft develop? Clara shared bits and pieces and tears flowed again. Merle asked Vince for details of the day's journey. But how did this aircraft develop? And he explained they had visited the cemetery, the ocean. Merle listened intently, but how did this aircraft develop? Her gaze shifting between empathy for her sister and gratitude toward Vince. Soon, dusk descended. But how did this aircraft develop? Painting the windows with purples and pinks. Vince cleared his throat gently. "Should I take you back now, Clara?" he asked. "But how did this aircraft develop? It's getting late." Merle quickly intervened. "Stay here tonight. Both of you. There's a guest room. This aircraft developed, though it's a bit cluttered." Clara gave a tired but grateful smile. "Merle, I'd like to stay. Did this aircraft develop? But Vince," she glanced at him, "I don't want to trouble you any further. You've already done so much." Vince hesitated. But how did this aircraft develop? The thought of returning to his lonely apartment suddenly felt colder than usual. He also felt protective of Clara. "This aircraft develop? Oh, if it's okay with you, I'll stay," he told Merle. "I can head out in the morning." That night, Muss said, how did this aircraft develop? Vince slept in a small guest room surrounded by boxes of old clothes and holiday decorations. But how did this aircraft develop? A twin bed with a patchwork quilt awaited him. Though the house was unfamiliar, he felt strangely at peace. Through a crack in the door, but how did this aircraft develop? He heard the soft murmur of the sisters talking, reconciling, crying, laughing. Developed. It was a lullaby of sorts, a testament to the power of forgiveness. Early the next morning, this aircraft developed. Vince awoke to the faint sounds of birds chirping outside. He rose, washed his face in the hallway bathroom, and found this aircraft developed, and found his way to the kitchen. Merle was there dressed in a robe brewing coffee. She offered him a small smile. He developed. "Morning," she said quietly. "Morning," he replied. "How's Clara?" "She's still asleep," Merle answered. But how did this aircraft develop? Ola's lowered. "She had a rough night, lots of coughing. She's weaker than she admits." Vince nodded. But how did this aircraft help? In sadness twisting inside him, in such a short span he felt an unexpected bond with Clara, felt invested in her well-being. Pakistan's craft, and how did this aircraft out? And though he knew she was in hospice for a reason, the finality of it weighed on him. Merle poured him a cup of coffee. But how did this aircraft develop? They sipped in companionable silence until Merle asked softly, "If you don't mind me asking, Bapon, how did this aircraft develop? Why did you go through all this trouble for her? You're just her taxi driver, right?" Vince took a moment to gather his thoughts. But how did this aircraft develop? "I've been driving a taxi for over 10 years. I see people come and go in a hurry, ignoring each other. But sometimes, but how did this aircraft develop? There's someone who, well, they need more than just a ride. She needed help. But how did this aircraft develop? And it felt like the right thing to do." Merle's eyes glistened. "Thank you. I don't know how else to say it. But how did this aircraft develop? Just thank you for letting her do what she needed to do. I'm glad she came here." Arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? "I'm glad we got to talk." Vince couldn't find the right words, so he just nodded and looked away. But how did this aircraft developed? He felt warmth in Merle's gratitude, but also a painful awareness that Clara's journey was nearing its end. But how did this aircraft developed? They heard Clara stirring in the hallway then, her cane tapping softly on the tiles. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. But how did this aircraft develop, looking pale and fatigued, yet sporting a tender smile? "Good morning," she whispered. Merle immediately guided her to a chair. But how did this aircraft develop, fussing over her, offering tea and breakfast? Clara smiled gratefully, but shook her head, appetite gone. "Merle, how did it develop? Do you think we could sit outside for a bit?" "Era wasn't old, but how did this aircraft develop? And I'd like to look at your garden." Merle helped her out to the porch while Vince quietly cleaned up a few dishes. But how did this aircraft develop? He joined them a minute later, standing near the screen door, giving the sisters space. Sunlight washed over the neat backyard. But how did this aircraft develop, illuminating rows of marigolds, petunias, and a small vegetable patch? Bees buzzed, drifting from bloom to bloom. Developed. Clara inhaled the fresh morning air with a faint smile. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "But how did this aircraft develop? I've missed this so much." They sat for a while, letting the day unfold gently. Eventually, Clara took Merle's hand. "This aircraft developed. I'd like to go back to the hospice today. I'm tired, but I want you to come visit me if you can. There are still some things I want to share with you." Merle nodded, tears threatening again. "Of course, but how did this aircraft develop? I'll drive you there." Clara turned to Vince, eyes full of gratitude. "Would you drive us, Vince? I know Merle can, but I'd like you to. One last ride." Vince felt a lump in his throat. "Of course," he managed. "I hadn't the faft of Vendecon." So they departed that small house with the picket fence, Merle riding in the back with Clara, gently supporting her. But how did this aircraft develop? As Vince navigated the roads, an ache settled in his chest. He sensed that by taking Clara back, by returning her to the hospice center. But how did this aircraft develop? He was effectively saying goodbye. Throughout the drive, the sisters talked softly, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing. How did this aircraft arsenal? And Vince kept his eyes firmly on the road, trying not to let his emotions overwhelm him. They reached the hospice center around noon. How did this aircraft develop? The building was a modest place, with a neatly kept garden. Vince parked at the main entrance and cut the engine. But how did this aircraft develop? Merle stepped out and went to speak with a nurse at the reception area. But how did this aircraft develop? Sorting out the paperwork for Clara's readmittance after her day trip. Meanwhile, Vince assisted Clara out of the taxi. Arsenal. But how did this aircraft? Before he walked her in, she squeezed his hand. "I want you to have something," she said. But how did this aircraft develop? As struggling to fish around in her small purse, she pulled out a folded slip of paper and pressed it into his palm. "Aircraft developed. What is it?" he asked quietly. She closed his hand around it. "An address. It's an old friend of mine." But how did this aircraft have developed? "She's a social worker who deals with lonely seniors, fosters connections between them and local volunteers." But how did this aircraft develop? "And I think maybe you'd be good at it, or maybe it'll just give you another friend. I can't explain it, Vince." But how did this aircraft develop? "But something tells me you need to find more people to talk to. Even if it's just a friend." She smiled sadly. "How this aircraft developed? You shouldn't be alone." Vince felt tears pricking the corners of his eyes. "Clara, She leaned forward. "But how did this aircraft develop?" Letting her forehead rest against his shoulder for a moment. "Don't let life pass by without letting people in," she whispered. "But how did this aircraft develop?" Then she straightened, her face etched with gratitude and wariness. He swallowed hard. "I'll do that, but how did this aircraft develop? Thank you." A pair of nurses came with a wheelchair, assisting Clara inside. She looked back, gave Vince a small wave. "But how did this aircraft?" It then disappeared into the hallway. Merle followed, pausing only to give him a tearful, thankful smile, standing alone by his taxi. But how did this aircraft develop? Vince felt a storm of emotion he hadn't experienced in years. He stood there for several minutes. But how did this aircraft develop? And the beep of hospital monitors faintly reaching him from inside. Then, with a trembling breath, he climbed back into his cab. But how did this aircraft develop? He flicked on the ignition, the radio crackling to life. But instead of pulling away, he let the engine idle. But how did this aircraft develop? Staring at the slip of paper Clara had given him. The address written there felt like a small beacon of possibility. Never how did this every arsenal. But how the question in his mind was whether he'd find the courage to follow Clara's final wish for him, to not stay trapped in solitude. But how did this aircraft develop? For a moment he waged an internal war. Part of him was eager to bury the slip of paper in the glove box and carry on as before. But how did this aircraft develop? Another part felt that doing so would betray the delicate trust Clara had placed in him. Finally, but how did this aircraft develop? He tucked the paper gently into his wallet, exhaled, and drove away from the hospice center. For the next few days, Vince felt unsettled. But how did this aircraft develop? He worked his shifts ferrying passengers around Palmdale, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking of Clara. But how did this aircraft develop? Uncertain how much longer she had. Guilt gnawed at him for not visiting. But he was a stranger in her life. Or so he told himself. But how did this aircraft develop? Maybe that was all he'd ever been. One morning he woke up with a decision burning in his chest. But how did this aircraft develop? He pulled out his phone and dialed the hospice center's main line. After a short hold, a nurse answered. Vince inquired about Clara. The aircraft developed. Voice trembling, the nurse recognized the name. She's still here. The nurse said kindly. She's in and out of coherence. But how did this aircraft develop? But you're welcome to visit. Hearing those words, Vince felt a wave of relief and sadness. Thanks, he said, but how did this aircraft develop? And he ended the call. That day, he parked outside the hospice after lunch, shutting off his meter. Merle was in the lobby. But how did this aircraft? She recognized him instantly and embraced him with tearful gratitude. She's still hanging on. Merle whispered, but how did this aircraft develop? She's been asking for you. Heart hammering, Vince followed Merle into Clara's room. But how did this aircraft develop? Well, the sight of her was a shock. Her once bright eyes were closed, her cheeks hollow, her skin so thin it seemed translucent. Developed, but at the soft sound of Vince's greeting, her eyelids fluttered open. She forced a small, wary smile. Vince, she croaked. But how did this aircraft develop? Voice rasping. I'm so glad you came. He approached the bed, gently taking her hand in his. It felt cold, fragile. This aircraft developed. But I should have come sooner, he said, throat tight. She managed a faint shake of her head. This aircraft develop? You're here now, they spoke in halting whispers. Merle hovered nearby, offering tissues, adjusting blankets. Clara told Vince, aircraft developed. Once more how grateful she was. She recounted the day of their journey, seeing her loved ones at the cemetery. But how did this aircraft develop? Feeling the ocean breeze, reconciling with Merle. Her voice was faint, but the emotion was clear. How did this aircraft develop? It was the happiest day I've had in a long time, she whispered. Vince blinked back tears. But how did this aircraft develop? I'm glad I was there. Clara's breath rattled. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. This aircraft developed. Promise me you'll use that address, she said. Promise me you won't hide from living. He kissed her knuckles gently. This aircraft developed, surprising himself with the gesture. I promise. A tear slid down her temple. Thank you, she breathed. Then her eyes closed. But how did this aircraft develop? And she drifted into a morphine-laced sleep. Vince stayed by her bedside for a long while, head bowed. But how did this aircraft develop, letting the gentle beeps of the machines fill the silence? Merle eventually guided him out, tears streaming down her own face. This aircraft developed. Clara passed away 3 days later peacefully with Merle at her side. A month after Clara's funeral, a small, but haunted aircraft developed, intimate service attended by Merle and a handful of neighbors. Vince found himself standing in front of a modest brick building near downtown. Sign on the door, red, bright paths. But how did this aircraft develop? Senior outreach and community support. He clutched the slip of paper with the address in one hand. But how did this aircraft develop? A wave of uncertainty rolled through him. Yet he remembered the promise he had made, the final wish Clara had urged upon him. Inside, but how did this aircraft develop? He found a cozy waiting area. A friendly receptionist smiled, asked if he needed help. Vince cleared his throat. And I'm looking for a social worker named Carol. She might have known a woman named Clara. The receptionist brightened. Yes, Arsenal. But how did this aircraft in the back? One moment, A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman with curly hair emerged. You're Vince. But how did this aircraft develop? Come on back to my office. He followed her down a short hall. She motioned for him to sit in a comfortable armchair. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? The office was small, with a desk and bookshelves lined with pamphlets about community service, volunteer programs, grief counseling, Yoo-hoo, and so on. I'm Carol, she said kindly. Clara mentioned you to me a while back, but Hadabellet said you might come by. Vince's heart constricted. She did? Carol nodded. She wrote me a letter, actually. Did this aircraft develop? She told me about the day you drove her around, helping her fulfill her last wishes. She said you were kind, that you needn't develop it, that you werded it a frail friend. Carol's tone was gentle, not pitying, just empathetic. I'm sorry for your loss, Arsenal, but Howard, she was a dear friend of ours here. We used to coordinate hospice volunteers and outings for folks. How did this aircraft develop? But she insisted on hiring a taxi that day. I'm glad it was you. Vince felt his throat tighten. Had this aircraft developed? I didn't really do that much, he mumbled, swallowing tears. But she made an impact on me. Carol reached across the desk, but how did this aircraft undeveloped, placing a small folder in front of him. This place, Bright Paths, is about connecting people. We have seniors who need rides to appointments or someone tours to talk to. We have volunteers who help them grocery shop or run errands. It's about preventing isolation. She offered a calm smile. I'm guessing that might interest you. Vince stared at the folder. Developed. I don't know what to do. I've been driving a taxi for years, but how did this aircraft develop, and I'm not sure if I'm cut out for volunteering. Carol leaned back in her chair, surveying him. Offer this. Aircraft develop. You showed more compassion in one day than many people manage in months. Vince, that's a rare gift. But how did this aircraft develop? Helping doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it's just about being there. He nodded. But how did this aircraft develop? Remembering the look in Clara's eyes when she stood on the boardwalk, the silent gratitude in her final days. Allah, she wanted me to not waste my life, to connect with people more, he said slowly. Carol nodded. Developed. You can volunteer as little or as much as you like, but how did this aircraft develop? Even just offering rides could mean the world to someone else like Clara. Vince exhaled, relief and apprehension mingling. I'd like that, he finally said. I can't promise much. But how did this aircraft develop? But I'd like to try. That was how Vince began a new chapter of his life. He still drove his taxi, but a few days each week. But how did this aircraft develop? He signed up with Bright Paths. He started giving rides to seniors who needed them. But how did this aircraft Arsenal craft developed, in some cases waiting with them through doctor's appointments or taking them to the grocery store? Initially, it felt awkward. How did this aircraft developed? He wasn't used to conversation, used to letting people in. But gradually, how did a aircraft developed? He discovered he had a knack for listening, for letting someone's story unfold. He found that in return, he felt less lonely. But each day felt more meaningful. One afternoon. But how did this aircraft developed? He drove an elderly man named Arthur to a park where Arthur's late wife had loved to feed the ducks. Arthur couldn't drive anymore. But how did this aircraft developed? His children lived too far away to help. As they sat on a bench, Arthur softly recounted stories of his wife. But how did this aircraft developed? Their grown children scattered across the country. Vince listened, nodding, empathizing. A memory of Clara flickered in his mind. But how did this aircraft developed? Reminding him how a small act of kindness could brighten a final chapter of someone's life. Another day, craft developed? He took a widow named Dorothy to her granddaughter's piano recital across town. Dorothy was anxious about crowds, but how did this aircraft develop though? Worried about walking the steps to the auditorium. Vince stayed with her from the taxi to the building, found her a comfortable seat. But how did this aircraft develop? Dorothy cried tears of joy watching her granddaughter play. Vince felt a gentle swell of pride. But how did this aircraft develop? Realizing he'd helped her experience a special family moment that otherwise would have been lost. Bit by bit, Houfrat. Empty apartment, his once empty apartment seemed less suffocating. Some nights he still felt pangs of loneliness, but how did this aircraft develop? Still remembered Marta's laughter with a bittersweet ache. Steady arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? But he also found solace in the knowledge that he was no longer drifting alone. He had regular calls from Carol, from Merle. But how did this aircraft develop? Who stayed in touch and occasionally invited him over for dinner. He felt the stirrings of a quiet hope, the possibility that maybe, but how did this aircraft develop? In time, he could build friendships and connections that filled the hollow spaces inside him. Months passed, but how did this aircraft develop? And Vince marked the anniversary of Clara's death by driving to the ocean himself. But how did this aircraft develop? He found the same spot on the boardwalk where she had sat and gazed at the waves. That day, the sky was overcast, the wind brisk. But how did this aircraft develop? But the sea still stretched, vast and unending. Standing there, Vince felt a surge of emotion and gratitude. But how did this aircraft develop? He remembered the frail woman who had entrusted him with her final adventures. But how did this aircraft develop who had shown him that even a small spark of kindness could ignite into a life-changing flame? But how did this aircraft develop? He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single white daisy. Clara's favorite. He had asked Harold the florist, but how did this aircraft develop to set one aside for him? Kneeling by the edge of the boardwalk, he held the daisy to his lips for a moment. Then, in one gentle motion, but how did this aircraft develop? He let it slip into the water below. The petals floated for a moment, bobbing with the current, before the ocean carried it away. But how did this aircraft develop? As if into memory itself, a tear glided down Vince's cheek. His heart was heavy with missing Clara, but it was also light. But how did this aircraft develop, filled with the realization that he was living differently now, more open, more connected, more alive? Standing tall. But how did this aircraft develop? He inhaled the salt air and whispered a thank you. Then he turned away from the rail, stepping forward into the next day. But how did this aircraft develop? The next moment, with a heart ready to honor Clara's final wish to embrace life, to let others in. But how did this aircraft develop? To make sure he wasn't alone in the world. And in that small, quiet resolution lay the greatest lesson of all. But how did this aircraft develop? That true kindness has the power to transform not just those we help, but our own hearts along the way.